After inheriting her parents' $150 million company, a woman finds herself battling not only corporate pressure but a manipulative husband who craves control. As she reclaims her life, an old flame reignites, bringing new love, unexpected twists, and a surprise that changes everything. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies, a fragrance she had always associated with her mother. Now, it clung to her skin like grief, reminding her with each breath of what she had lost. The funeral had been everything her parents would have wanted: elegant, respectful, attended by those whose presence was more obligation than love. She stood at the edge of it all, watching people mill about, exchanging pleasantries as if this wasn't the most hollow day of her life. The weight of their passing wasn't just emotional. Her parents hadn't left her with memories and trinkets, they'd left her the empire they'd spent their lives building. $150 million worth of legacy, a shoe company that had become an industry giant. And it was hers now. But as she looked around, at the faces that offered nothing but politeness and empty condolences, she wondered if the burden was too much to carry. By the time the last mourner left, her husband was at her side. He touched her shoulder in a way that felt more performative than comforting. "You did great today," he murmured. But there was an edge in his voice that made her stomach twist. Something wasn't right. Later that afternoon, when she entered her father's office, the place where her parents had built their fortune brick by brick, she saw him there. Her husband, sitting casually in her father's leather chair, his elbows on the desk, hands folded like a man surveying his kingdom. His smile was one of possession, not comfort. "I was just thinking about how good it feels to finally be in this office," he said, leaning back, his eyes gleaming. "You know, I've always pictured myself here." She felt a sudden stillness in the room, as if the air itself had thinned. "What do you mean?" He pushed a thick envelope toward her. "It's simple. I'm the CEO now. You don't have to worry about the company. Focus on us. On starting a family. I'll handle everything." Her eyes darted to the papers inside the envelope, divorce papers, crisp and clinical. "If you don't agree," he continued smoothly, "I think you know what to do." For a moment, she just stared at him, the man she had once trusted, loved. He looked so confident, so sure of himself. He really believed he could back her into a corner, that she'd fold under pressure, hand him control of everything her parents had spent their lives building. And then, it hit her. The sheer absurdity of it all. Her laugh started as a quiet, involuntary sound and grew louder, echoing off the walls of the office. Her husband's face twisted in confusion, then annoyance, as if he couldn't quite understand why she wasn't crumbling under his ultimatum. "You really think you can take this from me?" she said, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. "You honestly believe you have any power here?" The smile slipped from his face, replaced by a flicker of doubt. "The will." "Exactly," she cut him off, her voice firm now. "The will. You were never in it, and you never will be. This company is mine. You don't get a single piece of it, no matter how many divorce papers you throw at me." His expression darkened, but she saw it, fear. He hadn't anticipated this. He thought she'd bend, break even. But instead, she stood taller, feeling the weight of her parents' legacy shift from a burden to something she could carry with pride. Her laughter subsided, but the smile remained. "You've underestimated me. That's your first mistake. And it'll be your last." She turned and walked out of the office, leaving him behind in the chair that would never be his, the power slipping through his fingers like sand. The atmosphere in the lawyer's office was suffocating. It was small and cold, with the kind of sterile professionalism that gave no comfort. The lawyer, a stiff man with graying hair and narrow glasses, shuffled the papers before him. The will had been written years ago, long before her parents' death, and she hadn't seen it until now. Her husband sat beside her, confident, tapping his fingers impatiently on the table as if this was merely a formality. As if, at any moment, the crown would be placed on his head. But the lawyer's tone was calm, impersonal. As per the terms of the will, all assets, including the company, are to be left to the sole heir, your daughter. Her husband froze mid-tap. His head snapped toward her, and the silence that followed was almost painful. The room seemed to shrink, the weight of those words closing in. "Excuse me?" Her husband's voice, normally smooth, now sounded jagged, strained. "There must be some mistake. I'm her husband. I have." The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "The will clearly states that no spouse is entitled to any part of the inheritance. The company, the property, all assets belong exclusively to your wife." She didn't need to look at her husband to know what was happening in his mind. The cold rage was rising behind those dark eyes, the realization settling in that he had no claim, no control. Everything was hers. She felt it, the shift in the air, the tension tightening like a noose around him. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back, the calm facade gone. "This is bullshit." His voice rang out, sharp and furious. "You think you can just take everything? What the hell do you know about running a company? About anything?" She stared at him, her heart racing but her face calm. "I know enough to not be manipulated by you." His jaw clenched, the veins in his neck visible now. "You should be focusing on us, on the life we were supposed to build. A family, remember? What about that? What about our future?" His voice softened at the end, but she heard the manipulation in his tone, the way he played on the unspoken pain between them. Her stomach twisted. He knew exactly what buttons to push. Their struggle to start a family wasn't just a sore spot, it was an open wound. He leaned closer, his voice dropping, softening into something almost tender. "You think this company will give you the family you've always wanted? No. We need to focus on us. That's what matters." For a moment, her resolve wavered. The dreams they had once shared, the whispered conversations late at night about children, about a life together, flickered in her mind. But then, reality crashed back. Those dreams had never been mutual, they had been tools, his way of distracting her while he plotted. "You're only saying that now because you lost," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're angry because you have nothing." He opened his mouth to protest, but the door swung open before he could respond. His mother swept in, the air growing heavier with her presence. Her gaze moved from her son to the lawyer, assessing the situation immediately. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice laced with authority. She was a woman who demanded attention, always had. She carried herself with an arrogance that implied everything in her life should be handed to her, or to her son. The lawyer began to explain, but her husband cut him off, his face a mask of frustration. "She's refusing to give me what's mine," he spat. "Her parents screwed me out of the company. Out of everything." His mother's lips thinned, her eyes narrowing as they settled on the protagonist. "This isn't how things are done in a marriage," she said coolly. "A wife's role is to support her husband, to stand beside him, not hold power over him. You need to start focusing on being a wife, and maybe, if you weren't so focused on playing CEO, you'd have children by now." Her words struck like a slap. She felt the heat rise to her cheeks, the shame and guilt curling in her stomach. It was always the same conversation with his mother, how she wasn't living up to her role as a wife, how she was failing at motherhood before she even had the chance to be one. But this time, something was different. The weight of the will, the clarity of the words that gave her everything, gave her power, steadied her. She wouldn't let them drag her down, not this time. "I am the sole heir of this company," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It was my parents' decision. And as for my role as a wife, I think we both know that has nothing to do with my ability to lead." Her husband scoffed. His mother's eyes darkened. "You'll regret this," she said, venom in her tone. "The company won't love you back when you're old and alone. Think about what you're giving up. A family, a real life." She wanted to laugh again, but this time, there was no humor. Only resolve. "I'll decide what kind of life I want," she said quietly. "Not you." The nights were the hardest. When the house was quiet, when the world outside had settled into sleep, it was just her and her thoughts. The hollow ache inside her had only grown in the months after her parents' death. It wasn't just the grief. It was the quiet battle she had been fighting long before they passed, the struggle she kept hidden from almost everyone. The fertility treatments had started 2 years ago. The invasive doctor appointments, the hormones that played havoc with her body and mind, the hope that bloomed with every cycle and then crashed with every negative test. It was a war she fought in silence, one that left her feeling isolated even when surrounded by people. And now, with her mother-in-law constantly reminding her of her duties, that isolation felt unbearable. "You wouldn't have these problems if you just took a step back," her mother-in-law had said over tea the week before. Her voice had dripped with false sympathy, the kind that cut deeper than any outright insult. "All the stress from running a business like that. It's no wonder you haven't conceived." The words clung to her, heavy as iron chains. She hated that they lingered, hated that a part of her believed them. Maybe her mother-in-law was right. Maybe the stress, the long hours, the relentless pressure to keep the company afloat, were affecting her ability to start a family. But hadn't she been working before all of this? Before her parents died, before the stakes had gotten so high? Back then, when she was younger, everything had seemed possible. But now? Her husband hadn't helped either. If anything, he had latched onto the idea like a lifeline. "Maybe my mother's right," he had said one night, when she had come home late from a meeting. "Maybe if you focused on us, on trying for a baby, things would work out better. You've always said you wanted children, haven't you?" That had stung. He knew exactly how much she wanted a family, how much she had sacrificed to try. And he knew how vulnerable she was about it. He used it against her, even if his voice was smooth and his touch soft. The subtle threat beneath it all was clear: "You don't give me the company, and you might not have a marriage to save." She could feel the walls closing in on her. Every conversation with her husband, every comment from his mother was like another stone laid on her chest. The weight of it pressed down, making it hard to breathe, harder still to see a way out. In the quiet moments, when her exhaustion made her weak, she would wonder if it was all worth it. Was she wrong to hold on so tightly to the company? Was she trading away the family she always dreamed of for a business? She imagined her husband's hands on the reins of the company, running it without her. He seemed so sure of himself, so ready to take control, as if he were born for it. Maybe she wasn't made for this. Maybe her role was to be a wife, to focus on motherhood. Maybe she was being selfish. The thought had slipped in more than once. Maybe if she gave in, handed over the company, the rest would fall into place. She could focus on her marriage, put her energy into starting the family she and her husband had once dreamed of. She could stop the endless fights, the pressure, the gnawing anxiety that kept her awake at night. But deep down, there was a voice, quiet, but steady, that refused to let go. It was the part of her that remembered her parents' belief in her, their legacy built on trust and hard work. They had left her the company because they knew she could run it, that she could keep what they'd built alive. They didn't leave it to her husband. They didn't leave it to anyone else. They left it to her. And yet, here she was, questioning if she could carry the weight. She hated that she was starting to doubt herself. Hated that her husband's voice, so persuasive in its calm, was slowly eroding her confidence. She could feel the pull, the exhaustion of fighting against him every day. She was tired, worn down. The temptation to let go was strong. So strong. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. Could she really hand everything over? Could she step aside, become the woman they wanted her to be, and somehow find peace in it? She pictured it, her husband in her father's office, her mother-in-law smiling, herself in the role of wife, of mother, with nothing else to claim as her own. It wasn't the picture of happiness she had once imagined. It felt hollow, empty, like a life lived in someone else's shadow. But the ache in her chest wouldn't leave. The exhaustion had taken over. And in that moment, as the darkness closed in around her, she almost convinced herself that giving up was the only way forward. It was over brunch that everything started to unravel, though it wasn't a messy sort of unraveling. It was more like a quiet loosening, the kind that happened when you were with people who truly knew you, who could see right through the mask you'd been wearing for too long. Her friends, her lifeline, had gathered at their usual spot. There was Kate, with her lawyer's sharp wit and no-nonsense attitude. Anna, ever the nurturer, her warm eyes always watching. And Marissa, whose biting sarcasm could cut through the darkest moods. They were her people, the ones who had seen her through every chapter of her life, from the heady days of college to the ups and downs of marriage. And now, they were seeing her through this. "You've lost weight," Anna said softly, her concern breaking through the chatter. She always noticed. "You're not okay, are you?" For a moment, she considered brushing it off, offering some well-rehearsed line about stress and responsibilities, but it wouldn't fly with them. They'd see right through it. So she set down her coffee and let the truth slip out, piece by piece. It wasn't just the company or the stress of her parents' death. It was deeper. The constant guilt, the emotional manipulation, the weight of expectation from both her husband and his mother. The feeling that no matter what she did, it was never enough. "I just feel stuck," she admitted, her voice breaking for the first time in what felt like months. "It's like I'm trapped in this marriage, trapped in a role I didn't sign up for. And every time I try to fight back, I feel like I'm the one in the wrong. Like maybe if I just gave him what he wanted, everything would be okay." Marissa snorted, shaking her head. "No. Absolutely not. You do not roll over and hand him your life just because he throws a tantrum like a spoiled child. You deserve better than this, and you know it." Kate leaned in, her gaze sharp. "This isn't just about him wanting the company. He's using your pain against you. That's abuse, plain and simple. Don't you see how he's manipulating you?" Her throat tightened as she absorbed their words. It was one thing to feel trapped, it was another to hear someone else say it aloud. It made it real in a way she hadn't been ready to admit. She had been questioning herself for so long, she hadn't stopped to realize that maybe it wasn't her. Maybe it was him. Anna reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "You need help, honey. You don't have to do this alone." That night, she found herself dialing the number for a therapist Kate had recommended. It felt like a small step, but it was one she had needed to take for longer than she cared to admit. In the therapist's office, she finally let herself say the things that had been choking her for years, the pressure, the guilt, the overwhelming feeling that she was constantly failing at everything. At being a wife. At trying to be a mother. At living up to everyone's expectations, but her own. The sessions were brief, but they were like a balm. Her therapist didn't judge. She just listened, gently guiding her through the tangled mess of emotions and fears. Slowly, the knots started to untangle, and she could see things more clearly. "You've been carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations," the therapist had said one day. "But what about yours? What do you want? What would make you happy?" The question sat heavy in her chest for days afterward. What did she want? It had been so long since she'd even considered that. She had spent so much time thinking about what her husband wanted, what his mother demanded, what the world expected of her. But her own happiness? That had slipped through the cracks long ago. It wasn't long before the fog began to lift, and she saw her life for what it had become, a series of compromises, each one eroding a little more of her until she barely recognized herself. Her marriage wasn't a partnership anymore, if it ever had been. It was control. It was manipulation. The guilt she'd carried around, about the company, about her struggles to start a family, wasn't hers to bear. She had been twisting herself into knots, trying to be everything for everyone, and in the process, she had lost sight of who she was. Therapy helped her see that her worth wasn't tied to being a wife or a mother. She was allowed to want more than that. She deserved more than that. With clarity came strength. She realized that she didn't have to stay trapped in a marriage that suffocated her. Divorce wasn't a failure, it was a way out. A path to reclaiming her life, her happiness, on her own terms. She had always imagined divorce would be loud, shouting matches, accusations flying, doors slamming. But as she sat in the lawyer's office, the sound of papers rustling and pens scratching signatures felt far more powerful than any screaming could have been. It hadn't happened overnight. It had taken weeks of careful planning, quiet moves made behind closed doors. She started by documenting everything, every comment, every subtle manipulation, every time her husband used her vulnerability against her. There was no need for theatrics, just facts. She kept her conversations with him light, her expressions unreadable. He had no idea that behind her calm exterior, she was building her exit plan. Her lawyer, a sharp woman with no patience for nonsense, had been her greatest asset. "We'll do this the right way," she had said firmly. "Make sure he has no room to twist this into something it's not. You'll walk away clean." And so she did. Quietly, deliberately. Piece by piece, she put her strategy into place. The company's legal team ensured that her husband could make no claim to her inheritance. She arranged her finances, separating them from his in ways he wouldn't notice until it was too late. Her friends, discreet as ever, made sure she had the emotional support she needed without giving anything away. Then came the moment she'd been preparing for. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the house was unnervingly quiet. Her husband had been in a strange mood for weeks, aloof, distant. He probably assumed she was finally caving, ready to give in to his demands. Little did he know, she had come to a very different conclusion. They sat at opposite ends of the living room, the air between them tense but still. She had chosen her words carefully, practicing them in her head until they felt as solid as stone. "I'm filing for divorce." The words came out steady, calm. His head snapped up, eyes narrowing in confusion. "What?" "I've made up my mind. I've already spoken to my lawyer. It's done." For a second, he didn't speak, didn't move. The shock rippled through him, and she saw it in his eyes, his mind racing to catch up. When the weight of her words sank in, his face hardened. "You're not serious." His voice was cold, but she could hear the tremor beneath it. "After everything we've been through, after all we've built, you're going to throw it all away?" She met his gaze without flinching. "There's nothing to throw away. Not anymore." His jaw tightened, and she saw the shift in his tactics, his expression softening, becoming almost gentle. "This is because of the company, isn't it? You're letting all this power go to your head. You don't need to do this. You don't need to make some grand statement. We're still a family, aren't we?" There it was, the emotional blackmail. He was reaching, grasping at the only thing he had left, using their past and their failed attempts at starting a family like a weapon. But this time, it didn't work. "No," she said quietly, but with a firmness that left no room for argument. "We're not. I've sacrificed enough for this marriage. I'm not sacrificing myself any longer." His face darkened, and for a moment, the mask slipped. The real him, the one who had twisted her love and her pain to keep her under his thumb, surfaced. "You're making a mistake. You'll regret this." "I won't," she said, standing. "And you know it." She watched him struggle to find the right words, but none came. There was no more manipulation, no more begging or bargaining. He had lost control, and they both knew it. The process moved forward without the drama she had once feared. The papers were signed, the assets divided with precision. Her parents' company remained untouched, safe from his hands, just as they had intended. He tried one last time, in a quiet meeting with the lawyers, to appeal for more, but the documents were ironclad. He would walk away with what he brought into the marriage, nothing more. As for his mother, the fallout hit her just as hard. The woman who had lived so comfortably in her son's shadow, who had spent years critiquing and controlling, suddenly found herself without the luxuries she had grown accustomed to. The life she had envisioned, with her son as CEO and her daughter-in-law playing dutiful wife, crumbled as swiftly as it had been built. She hadn't expected to run into him that night. It was a small event, just a few mutual friends gathered at a quiet downtown restaurant for drinks and catching up. She had been invited more out of obligation than genuine enthusiasm. She'd been keeping a low profile since the divorce finalized. Still, there was something about the thought of reconnecting with old friends that pulled her out of her solitude. It was Marissa who noticed him first, her eyes widening as she nudged her under the table. "You'll never guess who just walked in." She turned, half expecting to see some familiar face from her past. But it wasn't just any face. It was his. Daniel. Her heart stuttered, memories flooding back in an instant. She hadn't seen him in nearly 10 years, not since that summer before he left for Europe to chase his career dreams. They had been young, so sure of their love, but the distance, both literal and figurative, had torn them apart before they even had a chance to figure out what they truly meant to each other. He was different now. Taller, broader, with a quiet confidence that wasn't there before. The boyish charm that had once drawn her and had settled into something deeper, more grounded. But his eyes, those deep blue eyes she used to lose herself in, hadn't changed. They locked onto hers across the room, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. "Go talk to him," Marissa whispered, a mischievous grin spreading across her face. She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening as she stood. It had been years, but something in her knew that the unfinished business between them had never truly faded. She crossed the room slowly, feeling the weight of the past press against her chest. "Daniel," she said softly, once she was close enough to be heard over the chatter. His name felt strange on her lips, like something both foreign and familiar at the same time. He turned fully to face her, his surprise giving way to a slow, easy smile. "I thought that was you," he said, his voice warm and rich. "It's been a long time." They stood there, awkward for a beat, neither quite knowing how to bridge the years between them. But as they began to talk, about the mutual friends who had moved away, the paths their lives had taken, the conversation started to flow naturally. He told her about his time in Europe, about building his company from the ground up. It had taken years of struggle, of living out of a suitcase and barely making ends meet. But now, he had finally found his footing. He was back in the States, more settled, more sure of himself. "And you?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "What's your story?" She hesitated, unsure how to sum up the tangled mess of the last few years. The company, her marriage, the divorce, it all felt too raw to unpack in one casual conversation. But there was something about the way he looked at her, a kindness in his gaze, that made her feel safe enough to be honest. "I've been through a lot," she admitted, keeping her words simple. "But I'm finding my way again. Building something new for myself." He nodded, understanding without needing to know all the details. "I'm glad," he said. "You were always meant for more." They parted that night with a promise to catch up properly, and over the following weeks, they did. There was no rush, no urgency like there had been when they were younger. This time, their conversations were longer, deeper. They talked about ambition, about the lessons they had learned from chasing dreams, and the things they had sacrificed along the way. He was no longer the young man who had left her behind, desperate to prove something to the world. And she was no longer the girl who had waited for him, heart in hand, only to watch him slip away. They had both grown, weathered by life's storms in their own ways, but the connection between them had always been there. Now, it felt like they were meeting again for the first time, with new eyes, new understanding. One evening, over dinner, she found herself opening up to him in a way she hadn't with anyone else. She told him about the company, about her parents' legacy, about the toll the divorce had taken. She didn't sugarcoat it, didn't pretend to be stronger than she felt. And he didn't offer empty platitudes or try to fix anything. He just listened, really listened, in a way that made her feel seen. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said softly, reaching across the table to take her hand. His touch was steady, reassuring. "But I'm not surprised you came out stronger." That was the thing about Daniel, he never doubted her. He never questioned her decisions, her strength. He saw her for who she truly was, not for what others expected her to be. As they spent more time together, the old feelings began to resurface, but this time, they were tempered by maturity, by the knowledge of what they had lost and found again. They both knew what it was like to chase something elusive, to realize that not everything in life could be planned. And now, with the years and distance behind them, they were ready for something real. One night, after a long walk through the city, Daniel stopped, turning to face her under the soft glow of streetlights. "I never stopped thinking about you," he confessed, his voice low, the weight of the years between them hanging in the air. "Not once." She smiled, her heart swelling in her chest. "Neither did I." They kissed then, a slow, tender kiss that felt like coming home. And as she leaned into him, she knew that this time, they wouldn't let go. The day the divorce was finalized, she felt an unexpected lightness settle over her. It wasn't about relief, exactly. It was about closure, about finally shutting the door on a chapter that had been more about survival than living. Her ex-husband's absence felt like the clearing of a storm, and with him, the heavy shadow of his mother's constant criticism vanished as well. The house, the company, her life, they were all hers now, truly hers. And so was Daniel. They had taken things slowly, deliberately. Both of them had learned from their pasts that rushing love often meant losing it. Daniel was careful not to overwhelm her, and she appreciated that. They spent more time talking than anything else, about work, about the challenges of running a company, about his entrepreneurial journey. Unlike her ex, he didn't view her success as a threat. He admired it, respected it. He knew how hard she worked and never tried to pull her away from it. If anything, he encouraged her to keep going. "You built something incredible," he'd say whenever she felt the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her. "Don't ever doubt that." It was a partnership in the truest sense. He wasn't looking to take anything from her, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she had to give up pieces of herself to make someone else happy. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, support, and space, something she hadn't known she could have before. Daniel understood her need for independence, for control over her own life, and he celebrated it rather than resented it. The company, too, was thriving. With her ex-husband out of the picture, she could lead with the clarity and focus her parents had always believed she had. Her decisions were sharp, her vision for the company clear. The shoe line expanded into new markets, and profits soared. Every success felt like a validation, not just of her skills as a leader, but of the trust her parents had placed in her. She was building more than just a business. She was rebuilding herself. And Daniel? He was there for every moment, every milestone. But he wasn't just watching from the sidelines. He was living his own dreams, pursuing his ventures, and it gave their relationship a balance she had never known. When they were together, it wasn't about one person lifting the other. It was two equals walking side by side, supporting each other without trying to control or overshadow. One evening, months after the divorce had been finalized, they stood on her balcony, looking out over the city. The warm breeze brushed against her skin, and she leaned into Daniel, her head resting against his shoulder. "I didn't think life could feel this simple," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of years spent fighting for everything: love, respect, control. He smiled down at her, his arm wrapping around her waist. "It's not simple," he corrected gently. "It's balanced. And you've earned that." She smiled, turning her face toward the horizon. The past no longer loomed over her like a burden, and the future stretched out before her, bright, full of possibility. And for the first time, she felt she could fully embrace it. They took their time building their life together. There were no rushed decisions, no impulsive moves. They made room for each other's ambitions, for their personal growth, and in doing so, they found a rhythm that felt right. It was a new kind of love, steady, patient, and full of promise. It wasn't about needing each other to be complete, it was about choosing each other because they already were. Her ex-husband faded into irrelevance, as did his mother, their voices quieted by the distance she had put between them. She no longer carried the guilt they had once forced upon her, no longer felt the weight of their expectations. She had built a life she could be proud of, professionally, personally, and the love she had found with Daniel wasn't the kind that demanded she give up who she was. It was the kind that allowed her to be fully herself, with someone who loved her all the more for it. In the end, happiness didn't come from one grand gesture or some perfect moment. It came from the quiet, everyday moments of joy and contentment she shared with the people who truly mattered. It came from the realization that she could have both, a thriving business and a love that didn't ask her to compromise. As she stood there with Daniel, the city lights twinkling in the distance, she knew she had finally found what she had been searching for all along. A life of her own, filled with love, balance, and the promise of everything yet to come. Being the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company was never going to be easy, but she had always known that. What surprised her was how well she had begun to balance the chaos of corporate life with the quiet joys of her relationship with Daniel. It wasn't about finding equal time for both. Some weeks the company took more, other weeks Daniel took more, but about finding harmony, learning to embrace the ebb and flow of both parts of her life. Her days were a whirlwind of meetings, strategy sessions, and decisions that could make or break entire markets. The shoe line had exploded into international markets, and she was often on planes, flying to fashion shows in Paris or meeting with investors in Tokyo. But wherever she went, Daniel made sure to be part of her world, without crowding it. Sometimes he traveled with her, always understanding when she needed space for work, and other times, they would reconnect after a long week, meeting in a new city to explore, just the two of them. They had been to Rome together, wandering the ancient streets hand in hand, eating gelato on quiet corners. They'd explored the cobblestone alleys of Lisbon, discovering hidden cafes and rooftops with views that made them feel like they were the only two people in the world. And yet, no matter where they were, he always made her feel at home. Daniel had his own work, too, which meant that sometimes they spent days apart. But that never felt like a strain, it felt like freedom, a space where they could both breathe and grow without losing each other. She loved how secure she felt, how they both had their individual ambitions, and yet came back to each other with even more to share. One evening, after an exhausting few weeks of travel and back-to-back meetings, they took a much-needed break in the Maldives. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, just a chance to unwind by the turquoise waters, with no agenda other than relaxation. She hadn't expected anything more. But Daniel had other plans. On their second night, he suggested a sunset walk along the beach. The sky was streaked with purples and pinks, the waves lapping gently at their feet as they strolled, her hand nestled in his. The air was warm, and everything felt perfect, the kind of perfect she didn't believe in before him. They stopped by a secluded spot where a small table had been set, candles flickering in the breeze. It was beautiful, but she assumed it was just another one of Daniel's thoughtful surprises. He always knew how to make the ordinary feel extraordinary. As they sat down, she noticed him fidgeting, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something nervous, tentative. He reached for her hand again, but this time, there was something different in his eyes. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "About us. About everything we've built together." Her heart raced. She knew where this was going, but a part of her wasn't ready to believe it. Not yet. "I love you," he said, the words simple but weighted with years of history, of everything they had lost and found again. "And I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I know we've taken things slow, and I love that we've done it our way. But there's something I've been meaning to ask you for a while." He stood then, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Her breath caught as he knelt before her, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring, timeless, like everything about him. "Will you marry me?" The world seemed to pause. The soft crash of waves, the warm breeze, the beauty of the moment, it all melted away as she looked at him, the man who had given her everything she hadn't known she needed. But she hesitated. Not because she didn't love him, not because she didn't want to spend her life with him, but because she had been down this road before. Marriage had been a cage once, a place where she had lost herself. And even though she knew Daniel wasn't like her ex-husband, a small voice in her head whispered, "What if?" She started, her voice faltering as the weight of her past crept in. Daniel stood, taking her hands in his. "You don't have to answer right away," he said softly. "I don't want you to feel pressured. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I'm ready, whenever you are." She swallowed, her heart full but her mind racing. She didn't need time, she realized. She didn't need to think about it. She had been waiting for a love like this her whole life, and now that it was here, she wasn't about to let fear stand in the way. "Yes," she said, her voice steady now. "Yes, I'll marry you." His smile was wide and real, the kind that made her feel like the luckiest person alive. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they kissed, the promise of a new future filling the space between them. A few weeks later, as they planned their future, something unexpected happened. She had been feeling off, tired, a little queasy, but she had brushed it off as the stress of work. One morning, after missing her period for the second month in a row, she took a test. When the little pink line appeared, she sat in stunned silence, her heart racing in a way she hadn't felt since that day on the beach. She was pregnant. She had stopped trying so long ago that the thought of it happening now seemed impossible, a miracle she hadn't dared dream of. But there it was, clear and undeniable. When she told Daniel, his face lit up with pure joy. He wrapped her in his arms, holding her tight, whispering how much he loved her, how this was the best news they could have ever hoped for. And in that moment, she knew life had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. She had the man she loved, a child on the way, and a thriving company that bore her family's name. She had everything she needed, and more than she had ever dreamed.